Okay, so we talked about Seneca Bluffs, its location. Okay, now I'm showing bank failure. Let me move this out of the way. Okay, so one of the main issues at Seneca Bluffs, one of the main issues the county was focused on was bank failure, right? And so what we were seeing was this is a bank along the larger portions of the property, and it was when we started looking at it in about the year time leading up to when we first started looking at the project, we noticed it was almost as much as a foot of year of bank had disappeared. And this was occurring by undercutting, leading to slope instability and basically sliding in. So you could see areas of old bank down in the channel as it would undercut and eventually slide in. And the soils here, for those people who care about soils, are Hamlin soils. So this is one of the last few areas in the city which isn't overly developed urbanized soil matrix, right? So it actually has a soil series name, the Hamlin soils. And then I think these are fluvoquents near the river because they get deposited. But so that mattered, right? This is sort of a relic natural resource in the city of Buffalo, one of these few remaining places that hasn't been totally modified and dug up. Okay. But we're seeing this bank right here was about 6 to 8 feet tall, so quite a bit of erosion. Okay, and it's not that the Buffalo River is really ripping right here. It's a pretty slow-flowing river, but it can gain a little bit of velocity during storms. But more so, the issue was with these soft soils. These Hamlin soils are mostly silts, mostly non-cohesive, fine sands and silts, and so easily susceptible to erosion at slower velocities, and that undercutting of that toe would cause that bank failure. Okay, so we saw this at a couple locations at the site. Now, why is this a bad thing? Some would argue, rightfully so, that this is what rivers do. Rivers erode, and so we shouldn't go poking around and tinkering around when a river is just doing what a river does. And most of the time I would agree with you, but sometimes we have to consider the larger context of what the restoration project is trying to do. And as I'll show on the next slide, as we look around, much of the Buffalo River is totally modified. This represents one of the few areas on the Buffalo River that is still a natural floodplain, right? It's still an unmodified shoreline. And so it is also one of the few areas that is open to the public and provides this type of riparian habitat. So just allowing it to gradually erode away isn't really a good option. We're losing a resource of real value. Okay, so that really justified going in and trying to address or at least reduce this erosion. And you can see some other pictures I've added in here. This is picture on the top left is a little bit further upstream, but there the undercutting led to about a 10 to 12 foot bank failure. So that bluff there, that eroded slope was about 12 feet, and that is active. That wasn't sort of a slow process over decades or centuries. This was actively occurring. The parkland was mainly concerned about it also because it was a hazard. People walked down here to fish, and this was a 6 to 8 foot slope. If they slipped down, they could get hurt or get stuck, depending on their ability to climb up the slope. So it was something that mattered to them a lot. In terms of ecology, it also presented some problems. One of the most important ecological zones are these transition zones between different habitat types, these edge zones, right? And so this Seneca Bluffs represents a location that has intact terrestrial habitat and that could be connected to the aquatic habitat. But this cliff basically interrupts that connectivity. It ensures that only during the highest floods do floodwaters interact with that floodplain. It ensures that aquatic organisms like turtles, frogs, other things are unable to get up onto this floodplain shelf because of that steep cliff. And so we would call that a disconnection in the connectivity with the floodplain. And also, as we've already discussed, because it's up there, the hydraulics are such that as floodwaters start to increase, rather than spreading out and dissipating over the floodplain, they eat into this lower part of the slope here, and they cause repeated undercutting and more bank failure. That causes more trees to fall in the water, more overall issues. And the trees in the water themselves provide a little bit of habitat, but they're really ephemeral. They sort of fall in and move downstream. So there's not really any permanent habitat in the water. All that silt and sand that's getting eroded away is shallowing up the Buffalo River in this area, so it doesn't provide any deep water habitat. The bottom is really uniform. There's no heterogeneity in the type of bottom substrate. So all in all, it's pretty plain and not good for any organisms really from the aquatic realm to the terrestrial realm. Okay, so some major ecological issues. And I mentioned before, we look at the context of the Buffalo River to try to understand what's happening. And maybe not, you can see my mouse, but if you start from the right and flow downstream from the right to the left, you could see the river does this turn. If you were to look closer, you would see everything is basically hardened. The Buffalo River is totally modified. This area on the left that I point to with the red arrow is a combination of sheet pile and stone, so that's not going anywhere. And actually, on this picture on the right, you can see this little point that is pointed to. For some reason, there's a whole mess of concrete in the river there, and that really locks in that point. So what the river is doing is coming down. It's stalwags in the center of the river. It's hitting that point and being deflected right at Seneca Bluffs, right at this area that is actively eroding. So now we can kind of see what's driving our erosive force. Okay, and this factors in thinking about what we can do and what we should expect with our restoration design. Now, we know we can't really alter the course of the river. Okay, and like I said before, we don't really want to just wait till the river clears out Seneca Bluffs because we'd be losing a large, important type of habitat feature that is publicly accessible and provides some of the only limited, remnant riparian habitat along this reach of the Buffalo River. So we don't just want to let that erode. So we got to try to figure something out. Okay. So what were our goals? Our goals were mainly focused on reducing that bank erosion. Okay. But also in doing so, we wanted to restore connectivity with the floodplain, create in-water aquatic habitat in the near shore of the river, create floodplain and wetland habitat, and increase the diversity of native vegetation communities. I also failed to mention before that most of the upland, even though it provided riparian habitat, was mostly dominated by Japanese knotweed. So the quality of that habitat was severely reduced. That's an invasive species. So we wanted to change that. We wanted to replace that with diverse native vegetation communities that will support pollinators, migratory birds, and other organisms, and biodiversity as a whole. And so why do natural and nature-based approaches? Surely one option would be to just harden this slope. That is probably a more traditional option. That's probably what the county would have done eventually had we not sort of intervened. Just sort of take the easiest approach, gain certainty that we're stopping that erosion and loss of parkland by either, dumping riprap or placing large stone along that slope to stop it. But we wanted to try to take a natural and nature-based features approach, apply the concepts of engineering with nature, which I'll describe in a second, to do a little bit more, to reduce that erosion while also providing some ecological value, ecological function, and societal benefits. Okay, and in doing so, we wanted to minimize impacts to existing habitat, balance the long-term stability of the project with maintaining ecological functions, minimize the impacts to the natural aesthetic, maintain accessibility to the shoreline. And so all these things factored into discussions we had. And we actually branched out to other partners like DEC. And you can imagine we had a range of opinions on the degree of hardening we should use, right? But ultimately, we gave most priority to the county's interests. And we had a direct conversation with them about the level of risk they're willing to tolerate. We knew if we relied totally on bioengineering techniques, green techniques, that there would be a high risk that erosion might continue. We weren't totally able to understand everything that might happen with the river. And so just placing in bioengineering techniques like live stakes or plantings or locked logs, given a large storm, there could be damage to that. And over the long term, we're not really able to guarantee that how long it would last. On the other hand, if we do all stone, we can guarantee that stability, but we can't really provide those ecological benefits that we're hoping for. We can't maintain connectivity with the water, okay? Impacts accessibility. So we had really direct discussions. We used risk matrices to discuss what the level of risk we're willing to tolerate. What's the consequence of, underbuilding versus overbuilding, and are you willing to tolerate that? And ultimately, the local sponsor, the county, was sort of fell more to the middle of the spectrum. They didn't want to have to deal with long-term O&M. They wanted some assurance that, erosion was going to be reduced, but they were open to the concept of relying as much as possible on bioengineering techniques. And so the option here, our alternative was basically a hybrid option, and I'll get into that in a second. But let me just give a shout out here to these two concepts which I brought up. One is engineering with nature. This was a core developed concept and initiative, and it basically says when we engineer things, we should try to consider their ecologic, economic, environmental, social sustainability, and try to build things that provide those engineering benefits as well as those ecological and social benefits. And natural and nature-based features are just those things that we actually build that provide a structural solution as well as or a structural function as well as producing other benefits in terms of economics, environment, or social, right? So we're trying to work with nature, do the right thing, provide both economic, social benefits along with our structural benefits. Okay, and again, why use natural-based features? It's better if I just show it. So hopefully this video plays. If you don't see it playing after about 15 seconds, let me know. But picture says 1,000 words. Video says even more. Now, as you see this video, I want you to consider what would happen at this location if we maintained the existing grade, which was over on the right. The right side of the photo, that's the existing grade. In the middle of the photo, this is an active floodplain bench we excavated. So our natural and nature-based technique was excavate this floodplain bench that can receive floodwaters, use stone toe on this left side of this lower bench. So we don't even see the stone. It's underwater. It just protects the toe. All this upper bench here is an active floodplain bench, and on the right here is our existing elevation. So what you're seeing is the final product, but compare and contrast that against what you might expect if this was just existing grade, the same grade as on the right of the picture, all the way to the edge of the water, where we see these live stakes, and it was just stone. So that might be a more traditional approach, and compare and contrast what you might see. And I'll narrate along. Apologies for any lag. So already we can see what we're seeing is 4 hours of a flood pulse in July of 2017. And already you may have been able to see as flooded waters come up, they fill in this active floodplain channel. So already we're getting interaction and absorption of floodwaters. You've also seen egret and heron and duck come access these waters that are on this low flooded floodplain. Okay, so they're foraging, and then as waters come up, we see a spike in the level. We'll see it drop back down a little bit more. The whole time we're seeing organisms accessing this shallow emergent habitat, right? Foraging for organisms. Fish are coming up onto this floodplain and finding refuge or getting eaten by these herons. So we're providing this important habitat that wasn't previously here and wouldn't be here if we just built hard shoreline along the edge, right? So that's what we talk about with natural and nature-based features. Oh, and now we can see the storm really picks up. Now it engages the historic floodplain all the way up, right? So that's about a 4-hour time expanse showing the upper reach. But the point is, for that first 3/4 of the video, we created an area and a habitat that provides a function. It absorbs floodwaters. It provides habitat for organisms, okay? And it's stable because the scour that's occurring, basically, as waters first get up, they spread out over that floodplain. They don't cause erosion. Eventually, when the river really starts cooking, it's all underwater, so it's not being directly hit by that scour. Okay, maybe just in the comments, did that video actually play, or was it choppy, or could you make out anything? Yes, if you thought it played halfway decent. Choppy but visible. Okay, cool. So some people saw it. So the point is, we saw that flood pulse up into that lower flood bench, and so I'll go into the detail now and talk about what went into that design. But I wanted to show you first what that benefit was to try to achieve, because I can say things like connectivity and habitat, and that means Not a whole lot, but seeing it, you can put a picture behind those benefits we were trying to achieve. And this was done on a pretty small scale, right? This bench, I think, was only 30 or 40 feet wide. Given more area, there's no reason why we couldn't do this wider. So hopefully this is a template for applying these concepts in the future. And if we did it wider, we could expect then not only benefits to habitat, but improvements to water quality, improvements to flood retention. Okay, and there summed up are those three of those main functions we're achieving through our natural nature basic feature: the absorption of floodwaters, the provision of habitat for a variety of species, and accessibility to water. So we don't have that in the video, but you can imagine kayakers now coming here, they don't have to try to scramble over large rocks if they want to access the shoreline. They can pull up right to the shore, right? Okay, so let me talk about our restoration plan and point out some of the individual techniques we used and say a couple words about that. Just checking my timing here. Okay. Okay, so what you just looked at is the area on the right side. Okay, it was looking upstream. So this yellow star that my arrow is pointing to is approximately where that camera was located, was looking upstream. So our techniques we applied there were cutbacks, so cutting back the existing bank, creating that lower floodplain that could be intact, an active floodplain bench. We did use stone down near the toe of the slope to lock in that toe. We also use stone tieback trenches. These yellow stars I'm showing are root wads, so I didn't point that out in the video, but I'll talk more about what those are. But we put those in the water, and so we'll call that reach 1. Moving further to the left, reach 2. This area we basically excavated a floodplain wetland. The brown trees are locked logs, so that's structural habitat I'll talk more about. So that's reach 2. Reach 3 is this area right around this big bend here, this pink and yellow. That was the area where there was the most erosion occurring. But we did similar techniques as I showed in that upper reach. But I'll show some pictures from that. And then reach 4 was this downstream area, not as much erosion here, so we just tried to increase structural habitat by installing lock logs. Now I'm going to go on and define what each of those things are. But first I'll show some before afters. So this is at reach 3, that area of highest erosion. This was about 6 to 8 feet drop off in 2015 before construction. This is 2017 at the first growing season. So at the end of the previous season, we cut back this slope to a 3-to-1. We used stone, larger armor stone in the water at the toe of this slope, then a finer medium DOT riprap slope on the lower part of this slope, again, to try to keep the undercutting from occurring. But then we basically relied on plantings and bioengineering on this upper slope. So it was a risk we had. We had discussions. Well, what happens if the upper scope erodes? If we're not putting stone there, we can't guarantee it's not going to erode. And ultimately we determined that's okay. We can allow these dynamics of erosion and scour and deposition to occur. We don't need to totally control it. As long as we protect that lower slope, we can minimize the amount of stone we use, saving cost in doing so, while also maintaining that upper slope and allowing some of those natural functions and dynamics of erosion and scour to occur. On the left here, you can see a root wad in the water. So again, that's structural habitat I'll talk more about, but it also helps to reduce flow. And here's 2019, very lush. So really important as we approach these restoration projects to not freak out at the first growing season and be like, where's all our plants? The seed mixes take several years to establish, and after year 3, it's really robust. We almost have 100% cover of a diverse mix of vegetation. You're seeing blue vervain and white vervain here, in a mix of native grasses and forbs. And we've been able to maintain that with less than 5% of invasive species in knotweed. This is the upper reach, similar in that it's a pretty steep drop off, although it's less height of a drop off. And here's what it looked like at the end of the first growing season. Again, we sort of cut back this lower bench and then a stable slope to the upper bench. And we planted and seeded it. You can see the root wads in the water here to slow flow and provide habitat. And then after 2 more growing seasons, really diverse, really lush, right? So this provides that riparian, herbaceous community. What you can't see a little further down is on those active floodplain benches, those get wet a lot. we've actually it's been a challenge. The water level's been over the past 4 years, has been about 1.5 feet higher than we anticipated. It's been about 1.5 feet higher than the long-term average during the summer. So a lot of these areas are more wetter than we've expected, but that's been okay. They are supporting emergent communities, and that provides. So right here, we're providing now 3 different habitat types that we weren't previously. The near shore in water with the structural aquatic habitat, this upper herbaceous riparian floodplain community, and then this emergent wetland vegetation on these floodplain benches. Okay, so we've taken sort of 2 disconnected habitats and created 3 connected habitats. All right, let's talk about some of the techniques here that we use. So for that cutback, here's Reach 3 and a concept of what we did on the right. You can see we use larger DOT heavy stone in the water. You don't even really see it. It's protecting the toe of that bank. Okay. On the picture on the right, I'll point out too, you can see a representation of existing grade. So this basically, the existing grade continued out and then was a sheer drop right down to the water line here. So we excavated that out, put in some stone along the toe, and then on all of the upper areas, all the areas you see this brown coir mat, there was no stone used. Okay, so we only used the stone at the toe and in the bottom portion of the slope where you see this hay mat over. Everything else was just soil. We actually, in that lower stone too, we placed the stone and then choked it with soil. We covered it with soil and put the straw mat over it. We were hoping that there would be deposition, and indeed there was. That's one of the reasons things got so lush really quick, is that now, even though this was a zone of erosion before, now that we've changed the dynamics and allowed the waters to gradually spread out over a wider area, it actually deposits its sediment. So we've had several inches of sediment deposition on this bank. So you can't even go, you'd have to dig down even to get to this coir mat. Everything's been embedded in natural sediments, and that's helped really this community flourish. So that worked really well. And again, we're contrasting this with maybe a more traditional approach of just hardening the slope or putting some solid things in where the water is. In this case, we're digging back, we're creating a new floodplain for water to travel, and in doing so, we're creating this slope. And again, we're 4 years into this, so we're really confident that this has become very stable. We're seeing more sediment growing up, and we're not seeing any evidence of any sort of failure or risk of failure at this time. So it's working really well. And that's basically it. So on top of this excavated slope, we use this coir mat. This is like coconut fiber, right? It biodegrades, but it acts as short-term erosion protection, helps hold the soil in place. We then seeded underneath it. We put live stakes on top of it. I'll talk about live stakes in a second. But one thing I want to point out is this dark row right here. That's sort of on the right side. Those are bundles of tree branches called live fascines. And I'll get back to that. So keep that in your mind. But this is how things look. This is further upstream. You can see the toe during a low water period with the stone, but it remains choked with silt. And then the upper areas above the water line are well established. And that was at year 1. So we've had more establishment since that. This was the upper reach, a similar concept, but just showing that active floodplain bench. So we put that low stone down at the toe of the slope, came up on a slight angle, and then created this active floodplain bench. This bench was only meant to be really flooded, a couple times a year, but because we're 1.5 feet higher than average water level, it remains almost regularly flooded every season, almost permanently flooded. So it's at least more soil year round. So that was about a foot above the average water level, which here is 572. One other thing that was really important that I wanted to point out, and that we actually was not expected. You can see a little, in this picture on the right, you can see this little change in topography. So these are look like speed bumps. There's a couple of these. These were tieback trenches. They're stone trenches that tie back into the toe protection, right? And what they do, the purpose of them in river engineering is, if the river hops up above and starts scouring out behind the stone, eventually it'll hit that tieback trench and that'll force it back into the river. So that's a pretty standard technique. What's actually interesting, the contractor placed them, and when he put soil on them, they were approximately 6 inches to 1.5 feet higher than the surrounding grade. And at first we said, well, that's kind of weird, but let's see what happens. That actually helped these areas be depositional, right? You can imagine now that because they're little speed bumps, they slow water down and it causes deposition of sediment. So that accelerated the rate of deposition of sediments on this floodplain, which is good. It helps us, if we're depositing sediments, then that's good. Then we have a supply of sediments there if it scours under other conditions. So that is what we want, and that worked out really well. And actually, it also provides a slightly higher topography, which provides a different vegetation community than the surrounding area. So all in all, good for biodiversity, and maybe a little screw up or unanticipated thing that happened during construction that was beneficial. This was the stone we used. All right, moving on, because I'm taking a little bit of time here. Here was an area we had this was a Midreach. There's a comment about back planting the trenches with willows. We did do that because it was so wet. That was shown after this. Contractors did sort of screw up because we asked them to put live stakes in the trenches as they filled it. They didn't. They didn't do that. They came back and placed them in later. Many survived. Some didn't because of the higher water level elevations. But good comment. Definitely something to always do is to put live stakes in while you have those trenches open. Okay, here we had an area that was dominated by Phragmites. We know Phragmites grows in wetter areas. However, Phragmites doesn't really like flooded areas. It doesn't like its roots to be constantly flooded. Especially doesn't like to be cut and then flooded. So we said, well, rather than just treating the Phragmites here, let's try to replicate some of these other backwater wetlands we have at various parts of the site. And so we said we could do that by digging this current floodplain down about 2 feet, 2 to 3 feet, and then planting it with emergent vegetation. And then it'll be deep enough, we anticipate it would receive waters during regular flood events, and because it would get wet so much, Phragmites wouldn't be able to establish. And so that was the idea for this floodplain wetland. And here's how things look. On the left, this was shortly after construction, first growing season. On the right, after a couple growing seasons. Now, again, because we had higher water level than expected, this turned out to hold water basically permanently. And it's really hard to get small little plugs established in permanently flooded areas. They kind of need areas where they're just growing in a mud flat before they can tolerate those long periods of being flooded. So we see a lot of that emergent community we want along the edge. You can see cardinal flower on this picture on the right, the bright red there along the edge. We can see some of those broad-leafed emergent vegetation growing. So there's quite a bit of diversity along the edge. But we weren't able to get that established throughout because of the deep waters. However, if Buffalo River water level drops, we anticipate that this will naturally seed and grow itself and colonize out into that area. And since this picture, we've done some replantings to expand some of that. So little by little, we're trying to build in along the edge. I mentioned a couple of times, okay, another technique, live stakes. Live stakes are basically tree branches. Certain tree branches, if you put them in wet soil, they will actually put out roots and grow into full shrubs. So in this case, we're depending on red osier dogwood, silky dogwood, sandbar willow, and black willow. The good thing about live stakes is they're super cheap. So this is a pretty standard bioengineering measure, right? The idea is this is an exposed slope. We want to get, vegetation established on it, but under high flows, it's possible that this sees a lot of velocity. So if we can get shrubs established on this, the shrubs can help reduce that velocity, help block in soil. Live stakes you can cover a lot of ground with. The downside is that there's often a lot of mortality. If you don't get the soil moisture just right, then then they'll probably die within the first year. So it's not unheard of to see 50% mortality. But at under 40 cents a live stake or something, you could cover in quite a high density a pretty large area and basically just hedge your bet. And so that's the approach we took here throughout most of the reaches. And just now they're pretty slow growing, but after 3-4 years, we're starting to see some of those survivors put out leaf and start to get bigger. Okay, and this is what they look like. They will start putting out leaf in the first season, but they're woody vegetation, so it's going to take a couple years to really gain some stature. Okay, here's the live fascines. This is something I mentioned it before. This really surprised us at how well these look. So these are like live stakes, but they're smaller branches. And rather than being driven into the soil, they're bundled up, okay? And they almost function as like a silt sock, right? In construction, you might see these silt socks you put along the edge to hold back erosion or erosive rills from forming. Well, you can use live fascines just the same way, but there's an added benefit. If they're under the right conditions, the right soil moisture, because they're made out of the same species as our live stakes, they will actually put out roots and start to grow. And so we used these mainly to see what would happen, and because we wanted to stop erosion down the slope, so we installed these. But after, basically after 2 seasons, we saw these things really start to take off. They grew really well. This line right at about the average water level did really well. It's a continuous line of woody vegetation that is now establishing. You notice the chicken wire, we had to add that because we had the beaver. There was a beaver, resident beaver on site. He would come in, he'd take apart the bundles, he'd eat the sticks he wanted, and basically he pulled out a whole row of these fascines. So you're kind of like, guy, we're trying to help you build this for you, and you're destroying your own house. It's kind of like dealing with toddlers. But to remedy that, we put in this chicken wire fence and for a couple of years while they got established. And you can see the sedimentation that has occurred around these live fascines. These were basically installed on top of the soil, and now they are embedded. And now they are growing as a continuous row of shrubby vegetation right along the water line. So really great bioengineered protection. In areas we removed that chicken wire fence, but areas where it was totally sedimented in, we left it in place, assuming that because it's pretty small diameter stuff, it would basically decompose pretty quickly. Okay. Some of the other things we did, just closing out Seneca Bluffs here. Let me check the time. Yeah, got a little bit of time. We're doing all right. So just want to highlight some of these methods, these things I mentioned. I mentioned root wads. I mentioned that the main purpose is you're adding aquatic habitat structure. You're adding things that fish can go under, that organisms can, that microinvertebrates can penetrate into, eat, lay eggs, grow into more organisms, things that, in that sort of submerged aquatic habitat. So to create that, we basically take a tree, small diameter, about 1 to 2 feet in diameter. We cut it at about 10-foot length up the trunk, carve the tip into a spike. We preserve that lower root crown, that 4 to 6 foot wide root crown. We preserve. So the way to harvest these trees is just to push them over, and all that complexity, all that complex woody entanglement that is what constitutes the root crown is really good habitat for fish, right? You can imagine all the minnow species that can find refuge and nursery habitat there as they get bigger, right? And so the way we install that is we basically have a trench. We use an excavator to drive that as far as we can into the soil, and then we anchor it in place with some rocks, okay? In addition to the ecological benefits, it also helps to slow down water near the shoreline. So you're helping to reduce some of the scour energy near your shoreline. Lock logs are a similar technique. Okay, again, these both can be categorized as coarse woody debris. They provide similar habitat benefits, although rather than being just along the shoreline, they're the other part of the tree, the upper 20 to 30 feet of the trunk, okay, and some of the main branches. And so basically, you install this in a similar way, put it so it extends out 20, 30 feet in the water, and it provides a different type of habitat. It provides that refuge habitat for fish, as well as, if it's right at the water line, perching habitat for waterfowl, for migratory birds, for aquatic birds like kingfisher, and for things like turtles. Turtles can climb up on here and bask, right? Previously, they really didn't have this type of woody debris that they could bask on, but that's what we added to a lot of the length here. And you basically lock that in place with some stone. And we were able to harvest both these, our root wads and our lock logs, from site. Sometimes contractors can bring them in, but if you have a site with the appropriate size trees and the appropriate species, again, you want to depend mainly on rot-resistant species. So you're talking your locusts, your hardwoods, even your willows will have a good degree of rot resistance, but you don't want to use things like pine, those in any softwood. Those would decay pretty quickly. So block logs can also be used with this other method, which I'm going to highlight on the next couple slides. Okay, so that basically covered Seneca Bluffs and some of the techniques. I really want to cover Buffalo River stuff also, but I'm going to do it pretty quickly because we're kind of running short. So this site is located further down the Buffalo River. It's the 301 Ohio Street building. It's right in the waters adjacent to there. To the north of that, the lot north of that is Riverfest Park. So that's publicly accessible. You can go check it out there. You can rent a kayak at Canal Works and kayak up to it. You can go to Buffalo River Works, which is directly across the water here. And you can see the habitat recreated. So historically, this was an area with a dilapidated mess of old wooden infrastructure. So it was an old wooden bulkhead. There were piles. Didn't provide any real good habitat. It was just a mess filled with junk and debris. These pictures are from 2015, and you can see this was right about the time this building was being built. And I want to give a shout out here because, this project we did for EPA in coordination with the Buffalo River AOC area of concern, right? It was part of the listing of the area of concern and providing habitat benefits. And the way we identified this site and some of the other ones was really Brian Hinterberger cold calling property owners and saying, hey, would you be willing to work with us? Would you be willing to give us site access to the river? So, sometimes we present these and it's a good reminder that they don't necessarily fall in our lap. Sometimes it takes using really basic but outside our normal work, methods to identify people willing to work with you. So in this case, the landowners, Ellicott Development, said, yeah, sure, you guys can access the site. We're building this. And they hedged their bets that they thought it might look better than this dumpy wooden debris. Okay, so you can imagine, I'll go through this pretty quick. This didn't provide a lot of habitat. That transitional shoreline, shallow aquatic water habitat that I mentioned previously when I was talking Seneca Bluffs didn't exist for this, right? It was totally taken up by this woody debris and so forth. And this was also a hazard too. You don't want people trying to access the shoreline because they could fall through and get hurt. So this is what the idea was. Pretty simple. Remove that woody debris, replace it with emergent vegetation, okay? However, we knew that there is some active wave energy on the Buffalo River. There's not necessarily high flows. However, during SACE events, during as boat traffic goes by, during windy days, there's quite a lot of wave against the shoreline here. So, and wave energy is not conducive with your emergent vegetation that's growing in shallow water, right? All the turbidity, all the movement of sediment, those plants can't grow. So to alter the hydrologic conditions, we thought, well, let's add locked logs parallel to the shoreline to help act as wave reduction features. These would be mostly submerged, like shown in the conceptual picture on the left. And that would allow us to place soil on the areas to the right of the locked logs and plant and establish the transitional, emergent, and sedge meadow and riparian habitat we wanted to create. And then on the other end, we could add structural improvements. We could add root wads to try to add fish habitat. And we did this at approximately 920 feet of the Buffalo River, right? And this was our design. This is the general plan for locked logs, which I want to include. It's kind of interesting. It basically is simple. Take a 30-foot tree, about 20 inches in diameter. We anchored it to 4 by 4 by 18-inch blocks on either end and drop it in the water. Ideally, these blocks sink into the sediment a little bit, and so the log sits right on top of the sediment. Unfortunately, at some of the locations at Ellicott, they kind of sat up a little high, which created some issues we had to remedy later. But we basically remedied that by using sand-filled gravel bags to plug up the bottom. But this was our plan, pretty simple. Here's what it looked like when we put locked logs in the water. They had precast concrete blocks. They put eye bolts in them. They notched the logs and then tied cables very tightly around them and then lifted them with a long reach off a barge and dropped them in the near shore at our desired elevation. We also dropped in some root wads to create that fish habitat. Okay, and that was good. In doing that, we created some aquatic habitat. So right there, we added something to the river, even though it was underwater. But after removing all that debris, we were kind of left with a mess. We looked at the shoreline. There was so much debris there that we tried to understand what the underlying sediments and slopes were like, but you really couldn't get a good comprehensive picture of that, right? We had little snapshots where we kind of looked and saw what the soil is. So we did not expect so much sediment stacked up against this retaining wall. And that all that sediment created a steep slope. So the concept of just placing fill material, topsoil, that we could plant on it was no longer viable, because as we know, the Buffalo River fluctuates, and once it hits that water on such a steep slope, that topsoil is gone. So we had to drop back and punt. And this is what we came up with. We kind of bumped heads together. We came up with some ideas internally. We scoured, examples of some, living shoreline concepts, and we came up with this idea of terracing. So we thought, well, what if we use more lock logs anchored in place to create a sort of terracing up this slope? Each terrace then could hold a wedge of soil behind it, and that wedge of soil we could then plant. And so we could do that a couple times, depending on the steepness of the slope, to create these plantable riparian terraces. And again, they would basically be created by these lock logs placed end to end. So here's what that looked like. So in this picture, you can see on the left, we cabled the logs to these large rocks, large boulders, limestone boulders. And the picture on the right, on the right side of this dirt mound are our lock logs. They are covered with the core fabric. And then we backfilled all that core fabric, basically creating like a taco, right? A taco of good plantable topsoil that was captured inside this core mat. And we wrapped it all up, tucked it all in, and planted it. And this is what things looked like. So here's the before, here's the after. Went from this messy slope here to now this stepwise transitional habitat up these terraces. We have I'm looking at the picture on the right. We have aquatic habitat to the left of the leftmost lock log. Then we get into this transitional emergent wetland area between two rows of lock logs. Then to our first terrace. I love the comment. Yep, topsoil tacos. Taco Tuesday, absolutely. And then we go into this first terrace where we were able to establish all this riparian vegetation. And we've done really well. One of the species that's worked really well at establishing in this is panic grass and also prairie cordgrass, so Spartina pectinata. Has done really well at vegetating this, and we also have milkweed in here. So we're seeing really good results in the type of riparian habitat establishing. And I'll flip through some pictures quick, but just another angle. Here's what we were dealing with in sort of the topsoil. And we also didn't want to move this topsoil around. We really didn't know what we'd find. And there was brick, and we figured there was no good planting medium. So on the right picture, we show this terracing up, this placement of soil held in place by these logs and these. In addition to just logs themselves in areas where we needed less of a slope, we just took that quarter mat, that coconut mat, and we rolled it into 6-inch or 1 foot diameter rolls and staked it in place. And that works really well for temporarily holding sediment back until the plants themselves can get established. So some other shots. All right, I'm doing a lot of talking, so I'm just going to flip through and point out some interesting things. On the left here, you can see, because we've had higher water level, this area we thought would be mostly riparian is actually shallow water. So in some of our replantings, we've moved some of our plantings up there, but you can see some of our riparian species. We have buttonbush there. You have the Spartina pectinata, so all that grass. We have some milkweed in there. Picture on the right, you can see all this woody debris has been really good. You go out here, you see birds perching on it, you see ducks on it. We even have a resident mink in the area we see running up and down it. Okay, and now he's happy because he can use that type of habitat to access the water to try to catch fish or try to catch other aquatic organisms. Okay, some more shots of this habitat. The picture on the right, these are just from this year. So this has been in place for 3 years now, or 2 years since we added these terraces. But things are establishing really well. We've had to replace some of the sediment in this emergent zone because we're dealing with high water. Some of it's eroded out. Like I said, we had to use sandbags to fill in the bottom of the logs. But we're keeping an eye on that to see how it remains resilient. Picture on the right, we have pickleweed. We have arrowhead sagittaria. Picture on the left, you can see some milkweed on the upper left. We have a couple different emergent species, needle rush. So we're getting quite a diversity of species here, right? And so essentially what we did, we turned that hard slope into a nice, soft, living shoreline, right? The traditional way, what the landowner likely would have done is just re-poured that bulkhead slope. But now we've created something living and alive, and that will be sustainable, because even as the logs erode away, as this vegetation gets established, we'd expect it to trap sediment. Last thing, I want to show this video. This is just the proof is in the pudding. We have a tern flying in, seeing a small school of tiny fish, and diving in and doing some fishing here. So, even on the Buffalo River, just like anywhere else, we provide the right habitat requirements, and the organisms are going to use it. So we're pretty happy with how this turned out. I'll skip over some of this stuff and just want to make some final acknowledgements. Really, PDTs on these projects have been incredible. We tried to do some really interesting stuff. Just want to call out two people in particular. Katie Lewis, for all the hard work on these construction projects. I asked her for about, a million mods, and she helped me get them all done. And I know that was a ton of work, but she stayed focused and helped us do all the great things we did here. And also Dave Mitchell, really instrumental in coming up with these designs and hearing some of our crazy suggestions for what we wanted to try and figuring out a way to put them on paper. So thanks to all the PDTs, members of the PDT. And thanks for everybody letting me present to you. And happy to answer any questions if we have time.
Hey, Josh, this is Todd. Excellent presentation. Looking at the list of participants, we really had a great turnout for this, and it's just a testament to the great work that's going on. And I appreciate you showcasing this. And engineering with nature, we hear that a lot. And this is more than a buzzword. This is actual practical applications of the types of ecological restoration we're doing in conjunction with shoreline stabilization. So it's a testament to you and the team, and I appreciate all your hard work and the team's hard work, and thank you very much for this great presentation. And for everyone on the call here, I've recorded the names on the side, so we'll be getting out PDH certificates to you, and I thank everyone for attending. And Josh, thank you once again for this great presentation.
Thanks, Todd.
Hey, Josh, this is Lieutenant Colonel Adams. I'll just echo what Todd just said. And sorry I was late. I was rushing in between meetings here, but for sure this was an awesome briefing. I definitely picked up a ton in a short amount of time, and really impressed with the production and also just the way you guys have presented these concepts. It's really awesome work, and for sure look forward to seeing this stuff in person. So thanks again, Josh. Really appreciate it. Good work.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. I'd love to show you the sites in the summer if we can, Colonel. Thanks. I'll hang out if there's any questions. Happy to answer.
Hey, Josh, it's Katie. Steve Winslow asked about the knotweed and how we controlled it at Seneca.
Yeah, sure. Great question. Yeah, so we basically had a 5-year plan for Seneca, and it was 3 years of really intensive treatment and then 2 years of following up monitoring treatment. And we've done really well. We basically knocked it down from 100% coverage to under 5%. It's really hard to completely eradicate. But when we hand it off to the landowners, to the county, we let them know it's really important that they try to maintain at least spot treatment every year, at least going out there and treating the small stuff before it can get out of hand. But basically, the intensive treatment was 2 times a season, going out, basically starting off with cuttings, letting the knotweed grow, cutting in June, letting it regrow a little bit, cutting it when it's about a foot tall, right? So that's an initial kill. Spraying it once it grows back to be like a foot tall with mostly glyphosate, occasionally glyphosate triclopyr mix. And I could go through more of these details if anybody wants them, if you want to try applying them, our methods. But so basically doing that twice during the summer with most importantly, the last treatment of the season really has to be an herbicide treatment in late September, early October, because you want to get the herbicide on the plant tissue at the time the plant is translocating everything back to its roots. So that's especially important for knotweed, because as anybody who's battled it, it's got tons of roots and tubers and spreads vegetatively, so you could cut and cut and cut and treat the surface stuff, but it'll pop up from the tuber. So you really want it to pull that herbicide down into its roots. And so we did that, again, you can have really controlled spraying if you cut it first and allow it to regrow a little bit, right? You can basically, then it's like knee height or less than knee height, and you can walk through with a backpack sprayer and get pretty good coverage. So we did that for 3 years. By the end of the third year, really by the end of the second year, we had less than 10% coverage. By the end of the third year, it was pretty effective, knocking it down more. And then we just followed up with some spot treatments occurring. We asked the contractors to go out 2 or 3 times a season, walk the site. If they see any, spray it, right? And that's basically going to be a necessary long-term activity to keep it from getting reestablished.
Thanks, Josh.
Absolutely.
Josh, this is Weston. Really, really great presentation and project overall. With your toestones at Seneca Bluffs, was there anything needed regarding settlement into the riverine sediments, or they just kind of placed and providing some roughness at that point?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, we didn't need to allow sediment. They were, they were excavated. The area around the bank and the toe of the bank was all excavated out first, right? And so, and the sediment wasn't especially mucky. So we did some geotech investigations ahead of time. Reed or Dave Mitchell, I think, were involved in that. They could probably give you a better answer. But we didn't have to. We didn't worry too much about settlement. We basically just excavated and placed the material in, and work, put a little bit up the slope.
All right. I think that, unless anybody else has any other questions. So, Josh, thanks again for your time. Great job. And everyone have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.